So, I'm Don Gordon. I'm the Executive Director of the Riley Institute, and it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you here tonight to Crisis and Response, Stories of Leadership. We're really glad that you're here. The Riley Institute is pleased to partner with the Department of Politics and International Affairs on the second Biennial Alumni-in-Residence program. Some of you are here for our first one, where we had 10 Furman alumni for a conference focused on national security and civil liberties. This second alumni program focuses on leadership during times of crisis. The Riley Institute is, I think some of you know, celebrating the 20th anniversary this year, and our year-long theme is principled leadership. And each of tonight's speakers has shown principled leadership in response to a crisis, and each of them has a compelling story to tell. We look forward to tonight. For a long time, we've looked forward to tonight. The Furman Advantage helped guide and create opportunities for each of these individuals, and we are delighted they've come back to their alma mater to share a little bit of these experiences with you. I'd like to offer special thanks to my colleague Jim Guth, who is responsible for bringing Eric Spittler and Amy Holly here to Furman for an entire week to visit classes and talk to students and faculty as part of the Department of Politics and International Affairs' first Public Officials in Residence program. Our other special guests, Ambassador Deborah Malik, Jason Terrell, Beth Niblock, are also here not only for tonight's special event, but also to spend time visiting classes, and earlier today they were part of the Pizza and Politics event with students. Thank all of you for being here. Thanks for coming to Furman to enrich our Furman community. And thanks for coming all the way. Ambassador Malik comes all the way from Kampala, Uganda. Asante Sana. I also wish to express thanks to Mayville Foundation and the Office of Academic Affairs for their support for this Alumni in the Residence program. Bill Mayville also is a political science graduate of Furman. This time I'd like to invite to the podium one of Furman's most beloved professors and a colleague who I greatly admire, Dr. Danielle Vinson. Dr. Vinson is a 1989 graduate of Furman, and she went on to get her master's and PhD in political science at Duke University. Danielle is a consummate professional, a thoughtful intellectual, and a friend and mentor of so many students. She's involved over 30 students in the research for a 2017 book, Congress and the Media, Beyond Institutional Power. In just 2 weeks, she'll be awarded the South Carolina Independent Colleges and Universities Excellence in Teaching Award as a ceremony in Columbia. Dr. Vinson, congratulations on your many accomplishments. Let's get it started.
Good evening. Thank you, Don, for that kind introduction. I would like to add my welcome to you tonight, and also on behalf of the Department of Politics and International Affairs, we're pleased to partner with the Riley Institute on this special evening for Furman. As Don mentioned, tonight's program looks at leadership during times of crisis. What does it take to be a strong and principled leader when you're faced with seemingly overwhelming challenges? What's the tangible impact of this principled leadership, as well as the associated risks? How can we as students, community members, faculty, and staff exhibit similar leadership qualities wherever our journeys take us? Tonight, we're going to hear stories from four of my fellow Furman alumni. Their areas of expertise in public service are diverse and distinct, but they share the common ground of demonstrating extraordinary leadership in extraordinary times. We'll hear from a current U.S. ambassador who played an important role in slowing and eventually stopping the spread of the deadly Ebola virus in Liberia. From a former Truman Scholar whose summer internship gave him the preparation and connections that led to his career at the FDIC and SEC, that's Securities Exchange Commission, not Southeastern Conference for the basketball fans in the room. In those institutions, he advised decision makers during the devastating 2008 financial crisis and its aftermath. From a problem solver whose path after Furman took her from political science to managing and unifying the IT for an entire metropolitan area, and who was so good at it that President Obama asked her to go help fix Detroit. and from one of my former students who developed his leadership skills at Furman and now applies them in his extremely important work providing support for Black educators in our public schools. Ambassador Malik, Eric, Beth, and Jason, thank you all for being here tonight to tell us a little bit about your stories. We're excited to hear from each of you. Before I introduce our first speaker for the evening, I have a few housekeeping items. First, we don't want you to turn your cell phones off, merely silence them. There are two things that Jill has said that you may do with your cell phones during tonight's program, only two. First, if you find someone's remarks to be compelling or a statistic to be surprising, we invite you to share your thoughts on social media and tag the Riley Institute. The other thing you can do with your phone is text your questions to the number on the screen. The number is also printed near the bottom of your program. Dr. David Fleming is with us tonight to help select the best questions, and we have Furman students who will read them aloud during our question and answer time. Feel free to send them in anytime during the program, and please be sure to include your name with your question. Our first speaker this evening is Eric Spittler. Eric spent over 25 years as a bank regulator, 18 years at the FDIC during two of its most challenging periods, the savings and loan crisis of the 1980s and early 90s, and the 2008 financial crisis which caused the Great Recession. He assures me he did not cause either of them. During the time of the 2008 crisis, the FDIC handled the failure or near failure of over 500 small and large banks. Perhaps some of you in the room may remember the highly controversial TARP legislation signed by President Bush in the late 2008. In August of 2009, Eric was appointed counselor to the chairman and director of the Office of Legislative and Intergovernmental Affairs at the SEC. He represented the SEC in congressional hearings regarding the Dodd-Frank regulatory legislation passed in 2010. Now Eric is semi-retired, but still serves as special advisor to the CEO of the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. Before Eric comes to the podium, please join me in watching a brief HBO trailer from the documentary Panic, the untold story of the 2008 financial crisis. Among the voices you'll hear are former Treasury Secretaries Timothy Geithner and Hank Paulson, former Chair of the Federal Reserve Ben Bernanke, and former Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama. Let's take a look.
We were a few days away from the ATMs not working.
Suddenly, folks are getting wiped out.
I asked her we headed for a Great Depression, and Bernanke said, you know, it looks that way.
I'd look into the abyss, and I would see food lines, millions of people unemployed.
Hank had just thrown up into a wastebasket.
I don't know if it was a panic attack, but the markets were so fragile. We were never going to let it get known. John called a press conference and said, I'm demanding the president have a meeting. It was high-stakes drama.
The meeting sort of descended into a little bit of chaos.
Barney Frank started shouting, "Where's your plan, McCain?"
At that point, it was dire. Congress can't get it together.
There was fear, and we did it without a playbook. The fact that the American public hates what we did is not surprising, because in many ways it's un-American.
Well, that gets us started on a high note. Good evening, my name's Eric Spittler. Thank you, Danielle, for that kind introduction, and thank you to the Riley Institute for having me here tonight. Secretary Riley's long been a public service hero of mine, so it's an honor to be a part of this program. I have to start with a disclaimer that the views I'm expressing tonight are my own and don't necessarily reflect the views of FINRA or the FDIC or the SEC for that matter. Those few moments in the video do a pretty good job of showing just how big a problem the financial crisis was in 2008. Whether you were a person who lost their home or job, a bank executive whose bank failed or almost failed, or a government official trying to keep the economy from totally imploding, it was a scary and often life-altering time, and we were trying to fix it weeks before a presidential election. And just as a reminder for those of you who may have forgotten, or in this case are too young to remember the financial crisis of 2008, the crisis grew mainly out of bad mortgage lending in the mid to late 2000s. Banks and other mortgage lenders dramatically lowered standards for lending. Previously, the joke had always been that banks standards were such that banks only made loans to people who didn't need a loan. But during the run-up to the crisis, standards were lowered to the point where almost anyone with a pulse could get a loan. And borrowers loved it because it gave them a chance to buy a home that they might otherwise not be able to really afford, or to use the home equity in their home for other purposes. Lenders loved the fees they received from the loans and the refinancings, and they even packaged them into securities and sold those as another source of income. And this created an unsustainably hot market. You had people with $40,000 incomes with 5 homes. Crazy stuff going on, and it all worked until it didn't, when home prices stopped rising for the first time since the Great Depression. The consequences of the collapse in housing prices was devastating. During the crisis, 8 million Americans lost their jobs, unemployment topped 10%, 4 million homes were foreclosed each year, 2.5 million businesses were shuttered, $20 trillion in household wealth was lost, and 60% of households had a decline in wealth. On top of that, around 500 community banks would fail, and almost every large bank in the country would require some degree of government financial assistance to survive. With values in free fall, credit collapsed, and businesses couldn't get the funding that they needed. The resulting crisis was unlike anything we'd seen before. It was bigger. Every sector of the economy was involved. It was worldwide. It involved almost every regulatory agency, both national and international. And the technology and communications changes over the years were making it all happen that much faster. CNN was running stories every day about which bank was next, and they were naming names. And sometimes they got it right, sometimes they didn't get it right. But the result was a complete collapse in confidence, and if you think about it, the entire financial system rests on confidence. And once you lose confidence, it's very hard to reestablish it. So the battle to reestablish that confidence was the leadership challenge of the financial crisis. Tonight, I thought I'd briefly touch on 3 key leadership lessons I observed from how the government responded to the crisis as we attempted to restore confidence. And those were communication, expertise, and courage. Communication was vital in addressing the crisis. There were so many different agencies involved in trying to respond that it was essential that all these agencies communicate and coordinate with each other, and that they do it clearly and quickly to bring a coordinated response. Miscommunication creates mistakes, it creates confusion, and that has an impact on confidence. We also had to communicate with the public in new ways and try to avoid unforced communication errors. At the FDIC, it was our 75th anniversary, so we were already aggressively communicating that people's insured money was safe in the banks when it hit, but that wasn't nearly enough. And we ended up so desperate to get our message out that we invited 60 Minutes to go along on a bank closing to show how we protected depositors. You have to be really desperate to invite 60 Minutes to go along with you. But we used every message that we could think of to communicate our message, and we knew we were starting to finally break through, oddly enough, on the comics page of the papers. When the Family Circus, I hope all of you know the circular Family Circus, ran an FDIC-themed cartoon, and they had little Billy with his dad at the bank, and he said, "Daddy, what is the FDIC?" And he said, "They protect your money, son." And in the next frame, they showed little Billy sound asleep, soundly, and his father looking in, and the piggyback next to the bed where little Billy had written FDIC on it. That cartoon now sits in the hall, the original sits in the hall outside the chairman's office at the FDIC. But at the Fed, they started running stress tests and publicly giving out the results. They were trying to build confidence by communicating stability. But communication's difficult, it can go terribly wrong, and you have very limited time to get it right. The outcomes would have been totally different if those stress test results had been different, or if someone had gone wrong with the 60 Minutes cameras rolling. As a nation, we were fortunate that the leaders of the financial regulators during the crisis were accomplished and knowledgeable experts in the field. The Secretary of the Treasury was Hank Paulson. He'd been head of Goldman Sachs. The FDIC chairman was Sheila Bair was an expert and had done research on subprime lending, the underlying cause of the crisis. Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke had been an academic whose entire career of research had been on the response to the Great Depression. And the now senior staff of the FDIC and Fed had been through the savings and loan crisis where they'd learned valuable lessons. That gave us an incredible foundation of expertise for the complex causes of the crisis. And expertise is important because it allows creativity and innovation. If you know the fundamentals, you can be creative on the solutions. If you don't, you're just trying to understand what the problem is before you even know what it is you're trying to solve. So the response to the financial crisis involved a number of new strategies we'd never tried before. The financial regulators threw everything we had at the crisis. We tried every strategy. We stretched the law as far as possible, and perhaps sometimes even farther. You had the Fed lending to AIG, which wasn't even a bank. It was an insurance company. You had the FDIC using the Deposit Insurance Fund to guarantee bank lending, not just deposits. You had creative legal interpretations to support all this. We had a key statutory tool at the FDIC that we needed to use that was triggered by language that talked about an individual institution, singular. And we needed our lawyers to build a case for us that an institution, singular, meant any institution, plural. And they were able to produce that under enormous time constraints and actually found legislative authority for it, or case law authority for it, which just goes to prove you can find case law authority for anything. These noted experts were also useful to us because they helped us restore confidence, because when we could put them on TV or hearings, people believed and trusted them. But the final piece was you can have all the expertise in the world, but it doesn't do you any good unless you have the courage to use it, and this is the hardest part of leadership. All of the people involved in addressing the crisis knew that we were taking steps to the outer limits of legal authority. They knew that they'd be second-guessed. They knew that if things didn't work, there'd be congressional hearings. Even if things did work, there'd be congressional hearings. But they used their best judgment to act, and if something didn't work, they tried something else. And courage was also the essential element of the congressional response. We reached a point in 2008 where we had used all the tools we had available to us, and we had to go to Congress and ask them for $700 billion and also additional authorities to deal with the situation. Passing that bill with its additional funding was essential to proving to the American people that their government was up to the task of dealing with the emergency. But some of you might remember that it failed on the first vote in the House. I was sitting in my office with my staff watching the vote on CNN, and they had a split screen. And on one side of the screen, they had the vote going down, and on the other side of the screen, they had the stock market going down even faster. It dropped 777 points that day, and there was no plan B. A few days later, after everybody sort of regrouped and we did some minor changes to the bill, the Senate voted on it, it passed, went to the House, and shortly thereafter, President Bush signed it into law. Many of the members who voted for that bill knew that it would be one of their last votes in Congress. They'd be defeated for voting for a bill to bail out the banks. But they cast those votes anyhow because they knew it was necessary to restore confidence and create the ability to save the economy. And that vote was a major turning point in restoring confidence and began the process of stopping the downward spiral and helping the economy recover. The one thought I'd leave with you tonight is that addressing a major crisis always has unintended consequences. Much like any other serious injury, it leaves a scar. And while ultimately confidence was restored in the financial system, the steps necessary to do it resulted in a loss of confidence in the political system, in the financial system, and the government. And the losses were severe, and few people went to jail, lives were changed, and people were left angry. And many of the 10 years later, many'd argue that much of our political polarization, our feelings about income inequality, the loss of trust in many government instrumentalities were created or exacerbated by this crisis. And I think it's fair to say that all of us who had some role in addressing the financial crisis felt that our efforts were necessary and that they worked. The result was one of the longest economic expansions in history, and the losses to the taxpayer were far below what many experts predicted at the time. In fact, on the banking side, many of the steps made money for the government. But the fact that the response proved so unpopular and had such a lasting negative impact means that our satisfaction and our accomplishments are necessarily tempered by our concerns about what it's meant and will continue to mean for our country. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. It's sobering to contemplate how close our country came to permanent damage for the economy. We appreciate your leadership and that of others who made those high-stakes decisions. Our next speaker also played a role in economic recovery, not for an entire country, but for one of our greatest cities. Beth Niblock is the Chief Information Officer for the City of Detroit, a position she assumed 7 months after the city declared bankruptcy. Before coming to Detroit, she was the first CIO appointed to a merged Louisville-Jefferson County metro government, where she spent 11 years unifying IT systems and infrastructure while implementing a new financial system, winning numerous awards along the way. She was tapped by the Obama administration to serve as part of a team of technology and officials to make recommendations for ways to support the city of Detroit as it emerged from bankruptcy. Spend enough time with Beth and you'll understand two things clearly. One, she's earnest in her belief that transparency is the lifeblood of a healthy government. The other, she loves big challenges. Please join me in watching a 2013 Bloomberg report highlighting some of the challenges Beth faced when she arrived in Detroit in February of 2014 as the city's first ever Chief Information Officer.
What's left of Detroit once the process is over? Now, Detroit is a huge city, 239 square miles. You know, you could fit San Francisco, Boston, and Manhattan inside the city's borders and have room left over. This was once home to 2 million people, yet in all that area there are now only about 700,000, a third of that, which means it's a very empty city. The dark blue areas, 60% empty. 78,000 abandoned houses, another 66,000 empty lots. You've heard that statistic, of course, that 40% of the streetlights don't work. Well, how about 60% of the city's ambulances? The city has 11,000 to 12,000 fires a year, the highest violent crime rate in the country. And those are problems that bankruptcy can't fix. What they have is a legacy of bad management. They have computer systems that don't work and are so far out of date they can't even be used. And they don't have enough money coming in to pay to fix any of that. More than 16% of the people in Detroit are unemployed. The median income just $27,000. The city's property and income taxes are as high as they can go by law, the highest in the state, and yet collections are collapsing. So once you get past bankruptcy, there still isn't much left to build on there. The city can't afford to provide services to that vast area. Residents have rejected the idea of shrinking the city. So far, nobody's come up with a good idea how to make Detroit viable once it gets through the bankruptcy
Nobody
process.
has come up with any good ideas? Are there any floating out there?
There are a few, but they're pretty much the standard ideas. One thing Michigan did was pass a law giving tax breaks to movie companies, but not enough of them come. Quicken Loans founder Dan Gilbert has done a lot for the downtown area, but that's not the rest of the city. What he's trying to do is bring in a lot of entrepreneurs, tech startups, and things like that. So far, they've created about 4,000 jobs, nowhere near what you need. No one has a plan to bring in enough jobs to fill in the holes in that vast city.
Wow. So our second cheery topic. It's good to be with you all tonight. It's been 35 years since I've been back on campus, and boy, what a treat it is to be back. So thank you. And thanks to the Riley Institute for asking me. I took a little bit different tack than Eric. Was a little less philosophical and more tactical about what we walked into when I moved to Detroit and kind of what me and my team did in response to that. So it's going to be a lot about the action. And I think that's the big thing in crisis. You know, a lot of times you can get paralyzed by trying to get enough information and to be sure you're right, but sometimes you just have to go. And so this was how we kind of got started. So you heard a lot of the numbers that they did in this report. So in response to that, I would say 68,000. Well, what's that? We installed 68,000 streetlights in 18 months. So what we did was we took what we thought were the Maslow's hierarchy of problems and tried to figure out how we could do them very quickly. So 68,000 streetlights installed in 18 months, 8.6% unemployment rate, down from over 20%. We still have the highest unemployment rate in the US, but it's getting better. 35,000, the number of people lifted out of poverty in the last 5 years, but we still have the highest poverty rate nationwide. 40,000 were the number of abandoned houses in Detroit in the year 2014. More than 20,000 have been demolished, which cuts down on that fire number that you saw. 16,000 have been boarded up in the last 2 years, and nearly 5,000 of those abandoned houses have been sold to people to occupy, to renovate and occupy. So how did all this happen? I really want to focus on 4 areas. One was bankruptcy. So the process of bankruptcy, when you move to a city that's gone into bankruptcy, there's a process to bankruptcy, which you don't think about when you're trying to fix all these things. But it involves innumerable hours with lawyers, accountants, and consultants who come out everywhere because they have a lot of money to make as you go through the bankruptcy. Figuring out what bills you can and cannot pay, because if you pay the wrong bill, it puts you in issue with your creditors because you've paid something that should have been discharged in the bankruptcy. In Detroit and in Michigan, there's a very interesting law that the governor can invoke and did invoke, where if he or she sees a jurisdiction in acute financial distress, he, in that case, Governor Snyder, appointed an emergency manager, and they usurp all the power of the duly elected officials there. So I came to work for a mayor who was sworn into office in January, a city council that was sworn into office in January, but the emergency manager was appointed in November, and they only had the power that the emergency manager allowed them to have. So my mayor was given the power by the emergency manager to do IT and HR, but the emergency manager kept police and financial responsibilities. And then the greatest joy of all is having to continue to work with vendors that you owe millions of dollars to, who are going to get pennies on the dollar throughout the bankruptcy, but you need them because you have to keep your systems working. So we went into bankruptcy, went through, the judge accepted the plan of adjustment, we got the unions and all the creditors to vote on the plan of adjustment, and we exited bankruptcy. In that process, $90 million was set aside for technology, which made me and the police chief and the chief financial officer the 3 who got deposed the most and spent the most time on the federal trial stand. So once we got out of bankruptcy, then really the hard work started. So we started with the things, as you heard in that video, our computer systems were very old. You couldn't patch them. The mail system didn't work. You couldn't open attachments if you actually got the email. So we said, how can we work up this hierarchy? So we put in all new networks, we put in new computer systems because we had to be able to communicate with each other. We put in similar software. We put in standardized software across the enterprise so that we could open email attachments because we were getting a lot of spreadsheets from the accountants. And then we went about, what are we going to do to make money? Because we have to be able to hit the revenue projections that were put forth in the bankruptcy. So we put in an all-new tax system, a new tax collection system, a new financial management system, because all those were money dependent. We put in a new electronic permitting and plan system because people come in and pay money to do permits to do work in the city. So we wanted to do that. We put in a new HR payroll system because the one that we were operating on was put in 1973, and I had exactly 2 people who could make it work, and one of them died. Mr. Butler, he was an amazing gentleman. Never underestimate how dedicated public servants are, because he could have left a long time ago, and he knew nobody would really get paid if he left. Public safety, you saw we had the most violent crime rate, so we said, what can we do to help bring down the crime rate? So we put in a new 911 call center. As you saw, the ambulances were broken down. They didn't have technology on them. They would take between 30 minutes to 3 or 4 hours to show up, as did the police, as did the fire. So we worked with all my counterparts in those departments to get that put in. We had an old jail booking system where we really weren't completely sure who we were releasing. We put in a new one. We put in a new real-time crime center. We have a lot of cameras around the city, which were a little bit controversial, but we have those all fed back to the real-time crime center so that we can do virtual patrolling of the city, because as you saw, it's a rather large city and we don't have enough police officers. We were one of the first jurisdictions to do integrated body cameras and in-car videos. So we did all that. We also had issues where the infrastructure, like the fire hydrants and things like that, the fire department would come up and they would hook into, and they wouldn't be working. So we were able to put technology in the field so as they pulled up in a run, they could see what fire hydrants were available or not available. The big thing, though, that we did is how did we improve the lives of citizens, because that's really who we're there for. So we did the public safety response times. We decreased the number of the fires, because there were a lot of fires that happened in Detroit. We reduced that number by 42%. Because the firefighters then had a lot of time, we cross-trained them as medical first responders, so we really got our response rates up. We had a 32% drop in the homicides. We had a 40% drop in non-fatal shootings. We put up dumping cameras because the wealthy people from the suburbs would come in and dump their trash literally in Detroit. So we caught them and made examples of them, and they stopped doing it. 30% of Detroiters don't have their own cars, and so we are very bus dependent. So we put in accurate transit apps. We got the buses running on time. We are a multilingual city, so we translated our website into Spanish, Arabic, and Bengali. And we're a very cash-based society in Detroit, so we put kiosks all around the city, in and outside the city, to allow people to aggregate their bills and pay their bills in cash. And then the big thing that we did is the mayor signed an open data order that said all data was open by default. It had been a big issue and there was not very much trust with the city. So how do we, do that trust? And we opened our data and put it out for everybody to look at. And now the real work begins, because those were the easy things to do. So the things that we need to focus on now is digital inclusion, and thanks to the Knight Foundation, I have a director of digital inclusion and equity. 60% of Detroiters do not have broadband in their home, and 40% of Detroiters do not have data plans on their cell phones, but yet the school system is assigning kids homework that's electronic. So they stand outside the libraries and they lean and they try to do their homework. We have to bring all the neighborhoods back. We've been focused on downtown and the midtown, but we now have a $130 million 7 neighborhood strategic investment plan that we just put in place, which is in addition to the other $42 million 3 neighborhood investment plan that we have. We have a workforce training program that we just announced. The unions are making a $30 million investment in training centers in Detroit, and it's very critical that we train Detroiters and that the unions accept people of color, because they have been absolutely kept out of the skilled trades. And then we have a lot of returning citizens, which are citizens that are coming from jail back to the workforce. So really working on them for on-record expungements and finding companies who are willing to ban the box and hire folks so that when you come out of the prison system, you can be put in a job and not go back into the same environment that you came out of. So slowly, and let me emphasize the word slowly, and let me emphasize the word together. Slowly, together, we're making progress.
Beth, thank you. What an incredible transformation the city of Detroit is undergoing. We look forward to hearing more about your team's response to this crisis during the conversation in a few minutes. Sometimes a crisis demands quick, immediate action, as in the case of the 2008 financial crisis. Other times it's more deliberate process built on creativity and ingenuity with determination and teamwork, as we just heard from Beth. Sometimes a crisis is ignored for so long that it becomes systemic and deeply rooted and can only be addressed with a long-term approach, one that shifts the paradigm to effect change. Our third speaker this evening is Jason Terrell, who's devoted his ingenuity and leadership skills to addressing the ongoing crisis of young black men, some of whom are failed by our current educational system. After graduating from Furman in 2012, Jason became a Teach for America Corps member. Jason competed in mock trial at Furman and even intended to go to law school, but Dr. Halvin Neubauer talked to him about going into teaching instead. Jason, we're glad you made that decision. While in Charlotte with Teach for America, Jason became deeply invested in the students as he became their mentor, athletic coach, and tutor, and he was struck by the great need for more educators who are men of color. Jason co-founded Profound Gentlemen in 2014 with Mario Jovan Shaw, and today he is executive director of Profound Gentlemen. It's a national organization dedicated to increasing the percentage of educators in America who are men of color. In a minute, Jason will come tell us a little more about the real impact Profound Gentlemen is having, but first let's take a look at a video from the Schott Foundation that describes the school-to-prison pipeline, a disturbing phenomenon which disproportionately affects young black males.
The school-to-prison pipeline is the description of how the school system is set up to push you into the prison system.
School's no longer a community. School's no longer a family, a place where we're always welcome.
You walk into school, the first thing you see is a metal detector. The first face that greets you is a school police officer.
All the kids want to do is go to school. They don't want to go to school to be labeled a criminal.
When folks talk about the school-to-prison pipeline, it's real. There's a direct correlation to lack of education, economic opportunity, and also incidences of incarcerations.
We have had kids in the system, hitting somebody with a ruler. We've had kids in the system tussling or fighting in a hallway.
They put me in a cell, took me and handcuffed me to the chair.
I sat in the cell for 11 and a half hours.
I was having an emotional breakdown because I knew in my heart that I didn't really do anything.
I just felt like I was being criminalized.
These are my kids, and this system has taken them and turned them into something they're not.
I think zero tolerance actually makes schools more dangerous. It creates the illusion of safety, but not the reality.
The concept of zero tolerance makes no sense anywhere for anything.
It's a recipe for disaster for a lot of young folks. We know that it doesn't work. It would be insane to continue this policy.
To feel alienated and to feel watched in your own school is not healthy for that student.
If you disrupt the positive things going on in his or her life, they may never get that back.
This criminalization is not just an inner city problem. It's happening in every school district, suburbs, inner city, all over the place.
What if we stopped and we looked at each one of these students as a human being and said, what can we do to help you become a better student?
Good evening. Good. All right, so my name is Jason Terrell. I have actually a PowerPoint slides. I'm a former educator, so this actually helps me track my time, and I'm also a visual learner, so I'm going to show some data points to the slide as well. So I want to quickly just first start by sharing my story. So I'm a Furman graduate 2012. I went to Title I school growing up. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia originally. But one of the things that my parents always had for me was this idea of high expectations, something to move around to. So for me, college was never like an option. It was always the demand. Like my parents said I was going to college, and that's something they embedded in my head. And luckily, I was able to bring that to my classroom. So I was a 7th grade and 8th grade English language arts teacher. I'm at a school called James Martin Middle School in Charlotte, North Carolina. I taught at a Title I school. 40% of my students were we call in Charlotte McKinney-Vento. Basically, that means homeless. So at night, my kids would go sleep in hotels, cars. They would come to school with their clothes in their hands. But one of the things that my students always had was this idea and this desire to learn. So this is them like reading text, highlighting text, doing really high-level, college-level work. My students were very brilliant. But the fear was that when they left my classroom, I wasn't for sure they're going to get the high-level experience to take them to a place like Furman. right? Even like, towards the end of the year, some of my students wanted to go to college and actually had Furman send college T-shirts to my students. So this is some of them posing with their Furman attire. But the reality is, and when we talked about Furman a lot, was that Furman is a very rigorous school, right? It's one of the best schools in the South. And these are some of the common stats about Furman students. So I want you to quickly read this. And just by show of hands from our Furman students, if anyone fit into any of these buckets, just raise your hand. If you had a 33.7, 1285, a 29-year ACT, or 80, did you take an AP or IB class? Raise your hand. All right. Luckily for us, we have very highly impactful teachers in our lives that help guide us on this track. And our theory of change is that teachers are the ones that are really the gatekeepers. They're the ones that recommend us for AP, IB classes. They're the one that push us to do a lot better in school. And there's overwhelming data that show that highly effective teachers are the #1 ingredients to student success. Teacher expectations are even more important. So when you have a student in your class, what you expect from that student matters more than anything, even of the lesson that you're teaching. The most interesting statistic that we really ground our work in is that when students of color in particular have black teachers in their class, they actually go to college, right? 13% likelihood to go to college if you have one black teacher. If you have 2, it's about 37. If you have 3, it's about 45. So this all relates to the idea of high expectations for students. But we have a really stark reality across the country, and I really localized this data to be specific for South Carolina, right? So minority and low-income students in South Carolina are disproportionately assigned to lower tracks, even when you control for achievement. In South Carolina, we have a really, really big problem when it comes to our teacher diversity. Currently, there are 30 school districts in South Carolina that have no Hispanic teachers, 4 have no black teachers, and 4 districts have no teachers of color at all, even though our school district is overwhelmingly minority school district. And this has serious implications to how we think about our students. So this is some data that I pulled from federal education data that shows that as early as preschool, black students are being suspended at higher rates than their counterparts, even though they make up 19% of preschool students, right? So data indicates that preschool teachers actually hold different expectations for black students than their white counterparts. And this actually has a very negative impact, or really shows up in academic data across the state of South Carolina. So earlier I asked you to raise your hand if you fit into one of those buckets. But the reality is, if I ask a high school graduating class at a lot of our high schools here across the state, they all wouldn't be able to raise their hand. Because currently in South Carolina, 26% of African American students even take the SAT to begin with. So think about what that gap looks like. But what kind of stuck out to me was that only 11% of African American students actually completed an AP or IB program here in the state of South Carolina. So again, we think about that gap, it really exists when you think about the student achievement gap here in South Carolina. So in 2014, we tried to figure out how do we address the problem of teacher expectation, of teacher diversity across the country. So I started a nonprofit called Profound Gentlemen. Our mission is to get more men of color to be teachers across the country. We do this work in 3 distinct ways. First, we work with pre-service. So pre-service means college students. We help college students basically go into the education profession. We do trainings. We work with colleges and schools of education across the state of North Carolina. We try to help build a pipeline and a funnel into the school system. The second leg of support that we provide is for teachers in that 1st through 3rd year space. And this is actually the most critical time for a teacher. I know as a 1st-year teacher, I was actually not very effective. I didn't spend a lot of time actually working on my instruction. I spent a lot of time working on my behavior management and my classroom control. And actually 30% of teachers in their 1st year leave the classroom altogether across the country. And for teachers in Title I schools, this statistic is about 50%. So we want to give a lot of support to our 1st and 3rd year teachers to make sure they actually are good teachers, to ground them in best teaching practices. And the last leg of support that we provide is for men who are 4 years and 4 years plus. So these men are looking to go into leadership opportunities. They want to make teaching a long-term career, but there are not a lot of platforms and opportunities for them to do that. So we provide opportunities for teachers to be board certified, go into school leadership, get additional degrees so that actually can stay in the field of education and make tremendous impact. But one of the things that we consistently teach in our program and throughout our development is this idea of recognizing genius, right? We have to think about how do we change the narrative of what we think about our students when they step in front of us. So the first thing that an educator receives when they come into our program is around implicit bias training. We actually leave our students or talk them to our teachers with these 3 particular points. I want to really talk about the last point. Oftentimes when we think about students of color, especially educators have this problem. We often focus on the challenges that our students bring to the table and not their successes. When we think about our students, it's in deficit language or deficit mindsets. And we exhibit this when it comes to suspensions, when it comes to recommending students for IP and IB programs, and even through our teaching practices. So we do a lot of work with implicit bias, really digging deep into what our teachers are bringing to the table. And this is some of the quotes and things that we like to share, and we have exercises that we work with our teachers on. And finally, one of the things that we really want to continue to hound upon is the idea that what you think about your students matters more than anything in the world. It matters more than curriculum. It matters more than testing. So this is a famous quote by Thomas Cooley. He was a state judge or a Superior Court judge. But it says, "I am not who you think I am. I am not who I think I am. I am who I think you think I am." And my students really gravitated to that particular quote. When they were in my classroom, they just wanted to be confirmed. A lot of times they were not getting that at home. So as a teacher, we have to train our teachers in this idea of uplifting students in a positive light. So there's a lot of ways that I think solving the school-to-prison pipeline is very nuanced. Again, we particularly looked at one specific track of getting more teachers of color in the classroom and really training them on this idea of having implicit language, a positive language. But there's a lot of different tracks. I don't want to necessarily say that we have the sole solution. So we're always looking for other folks to kind of join in the movement to ensure that our students have equitable outcomes. Thank you.
Jason, thank you so much for pursuing your passions while addressing this crisis in our communities. Your dedication and determination to improving the trajectory of these lives for these young men of color is inspiring to us. Our last speaker this evening is the current U.S. Ambassador to Uganda, who was also Ambassador to Liberia from 2012 to 2015, including several intense months during the Ebola outbreak. A career Foreign Service officer, Ambassador Deborah Malik has been with the State Department since 1981. She previously served as Director of the Office of East African Affairs at the State Department, and she's held numerous roles at embassies in Ethiopia, Senegal, Thailand, South Africa, and Cameroon. When Ambassador Malik was at Furman, she wasn't satisfied with the traditional majors that were available, so she worked with professors in the Political Science Department to create an ICP, an individualized curriculum program, and so she now holds a BA in International Studies. She says that the most important lesson she learned at Furman was perseverance. Problems have solutions if you work at them. Ambassador Malik, you clearly demonstrated perseverance in addressing the crisis of the Ebola outbreak in Liberia, and we're grateful to you for making the trip from Uganda to be with us tonight. Before Ambassador Malik speaks, let's watch Doctors Without Borders video from August 2014 that highlights how overwhelmed the limited healthcare facilities and workers were as the Ebola outbreak spread around the city of Monrovia and the country of Liberia.
The numbers is going up rapidly, faster than what we thought, forcing us to adapt our plans and our strategy on a daily basis. It is really an extremely challenging situation for everyone. And MSF, we can't do more than we're doing now. We've opened this center a week ago. It's completely full today. We are desperately trying to get more beds. We have bulldozers and rub holes getting up. We're recruiting staff, we're training staff, but we would like to do much more, but our first priority needs to be the security and safety of our staff. So we can't go faster than what is safe. Ebola today is all over the city. All areas, all districts of the city today have people dying and people getting sick every day. So the population has turned and they are now afraid. They are asking for help. They They don't know how to respond to this, because if they call the hotline, nobody will come and pick them up because the system is completely overstretched. There are too many and the response is too weak. It's very important to understand today this is more than an Ebola outbreak. Today we're facing a humanitarian crisis, and it's evolving in front of our eyes, and it's getting worse every day. The healthcare system has more or less broken down. Hospitals are closed, clinics are closed, some of them have reopened, but the staff is afraid to go back because they're afraid to get the disease. There's been too many healthcare workers who died. It's not only Ebola that is a threat to people's lives, it's all other diseases as well.
Good evening. Thank you to the Riley Center for inviting me back. Some of you might have seen me a couple of years ago, where I came to actually talk specifically about what we were doing in Liberia during the Ebola crisis. Tonight I'm going to take a slightly different tack, and the advantage and disadvantage of being the last speaker is that a lot of it's already been said in a different context. And the disadvantage is, that's the advantage. The disadvantage is that I'm not sure I can stand up to some of the great presentations that have already been made. But the way I wanted to approach this evening was to really talk about sort of some key leadership principles that I take from what we did in the context of the Ebola response, which was, as you see here, this was taken in August. We thought things were bad, they got worse. We had been dealing with Ebola since March of 2014, and we thought we had beaten it back in May. And then in June, in late June and early July, it came roaring back, and it was in the city of Monrovia, a city of 1.5 million people, with people in very close proximity and a highly transient population. So once it started, and we had the first cluster of cases, from there it just sort of spread. And what you don't see here in this particular video is that in those ensuing months, there were dead bodies in the street. You would see, some of you may have seen footage at the time of an Ebola patient escaping from one of these treatment units and running through the marketplace. Now, these are all kinds of things that lead you to panic and to wonder what you can do and how you're going to stop this disease from spreading. But what we learned in the course of this was that, first and foremost, the way you address a crisis like this, which was not something that any of us that were working at the embassy, and especially myself, were prepared to deal with, because we knew very little about Ebola. Ebola had never been seen in West Africa. So unlike places like Uganda and Congo, where they had dealt with Ebola in the past, they'd never seen it in that part of the world. And Doctors Without Borders, who came to help, was the only organization in the entire world that was trained to actually address and treat Ebola patients, because they were the ones with the resident experience. So when they came, and what you saw here, they built a treatment unit that had 40 beds, which was the largest that they had ever used anywhere in the world. That facility eventually had 100 beds, and it was still not enough. That was the number of, we were turning people away who were sick, and we were sending them back home into the community because there was no place for them to go. And shortly after, around the time that this video was made, Doctors Without Borders was sitting in my office, which they don't normally do. They generally don't, they keep their distance from the US government, pleading with us to send in US military doctors. And the reason for this was not because they thought the military was the solution to the answer, it was the solution to the problem. But as you heard, we were so overwhelmed. There were so many patients, not enough beds, and they couldn't train people fast enough. And they thought if they start with US military doctors, there's someone they can train who can then take this over. But I digress. I could go on all night about Ebola, but I think there's a few key principles that came out, and I will illustrate some of the things that happened with this. First and foremost, you have to be present and you have to be seen. So leadership really is about showing up. And so in the context of everything that was going on in a country that was ill-equipped to respond to this, what was critically important for us as the U.S. government and as one of the good partners of Liberia was to be seen, to be there, to be around, to be supportive of the government and its efforts, and to show that we actually believed that there was a way to get through all of this. And so I spent a lot of time, meeting with the president, meeting with the technical folks who were addressing the crisis. We started out with a very small footprint, but then that grew over time. The second issue is really communicate and share information. You heard this from the earlier speakers, and this is absolutely critical in any crisis, because what happens very quickly, especially when people are scared, and especially when they're afraid they're going to die, even if there's not really any real direct threat to them, is that people don't hear you. You need to calm them down, and the best way to do that is to inundate them with information. But first you have to educate yourself. You have to understand what the scope of the problem is, but you also need to make sure that you're getting out the most accurate information, and you have to find the messenger that can actually deliver that information, because that's a real challenge. So we were, in our bully pulpit as the U.S. government and the U.S. Embassy, people looked to us to give them the right information. They had very little trust in their own government, but they would look to our webpage, they would look to the statements that we put out, we would go on the radio, we were handing out all kinds of pieces of paper with basic information about what you needed to do to protect yourself from Ebola. And that was the government itself, the government of Liberia was referring people to our website to go see what the Americans are saying, and that was basically the source of their information. But the problem was the disease continued to spread because we approached it with this very sort of Western approach that here's what you need to do. You have symptoms, we take you from your home, we put you in a treatment unit, and hopefully you'll survive, but more likely you're going to die and your family will never see you again. That, in a cultural context that's very different from our own, is a very difficult thing to tell people. You have to give up your child, you have to leave your sick mother, and you may never see them again because they're going to go off and be treated when there's no cure and there's no treatment. But they didn't want to hear that from a medical person, so we had to find somebody else who could deliver this message. So we had to work with, with ministers, we had to work with doctors, we had to work with anyone we could find who would resonate with a particular community. Because some people would listen to their minister, but other people wanted somebody else, and if the message wasn't right, it didn't matter what you were, because if they weren't hearing it from the right person, it didn't matter whether the message was effective or not. But ultimately, it's about sharing information, and that feedback loop has to be continuous, and it has to change, because the messaging, if you look at what we were saying at the beginning of the outbreak and what we were saying towards the end of the epidemic, very, very different, because we had to tailor that message to make sure people were hearing it. Focus on the solution and not the problem. So I think it's really, you understand the problem, but if you spend too much time trying to analyze it in every single detail and find the perfect solution, you'll never do anything. And when you have a crisis that is spinning out of control, we equated it often to a boulder running down a hill. We were, for much of the first 7 or 8 months in 2014, we were running behind it, just trying to catch up, hoping to get somewhere so that we could maybe get a hand on it and start to slow the pace. So we had to act. We had to try to find solutions and bite it off in little digestible pieces. And we were able to do that as we started to mobilize more assistance to come into Liberia. We were able to put together a coalition, not just from within U.S. government agencies and entities, but from international organizations, from other countries. We would take help from anywhere, and then helping the government try to coordinate and collaborate so that we could throw everything we could against that and maybe somehow slow that boulder going down the hill. Jump the queue if necessary. So if you ever find yourself in a crisis situation and you're the person that everybody is, you look around and you go, okay, so who's going to deal with this? And suddenly you realize that everybody's looking at you, is that sometimes you just have to not play by the rules. Now, I don't mean you don't break the law and you don't do things that are unethical or immoral, but it means that sometimes you got to shake things up in order to get attention. So if they say, no, you have to do it this way, and no, you have to go through this process, that is absolutely the wrong way to address a crisis, especially if it's spiraling out of control. You heard from Eric, for example, you got to figure out what's going to work and deal with the consequences later. And so we do get paralyzed sometimes and say, oh, well, we can't do this, or I'm going to look at this a little longer. But there's one thing I regret about the role I played and the things that we did over the course of that of 2014, certainly, it's that I didn't yell louder and longer a lot earlier than I did, because I assumed certain things would happen, that certain organizations or entities or people would do certain things wrongly. So I will never make that mistake again. But really, don't be shy about standing up and saying, wait a minute, we demand attention, this has to be addressed. And finally, take action, even if your decision is actually that you don't need to take any action. There has to be some evidence that you're doing something, because you'll be blamed or praised whether you do something or you don't do something. So make the best judgment possible. Take an action and take a decision so that you can at least document that you have thought about it and you have decided that in this instance, maybe we need to wait just a little bit longer and see if this plays out. And in other times, it really calls for action and you'll deal with the consequences later. So, fighting a disease is a little bit different than some of the other humanitarian crises that we often are called upon to address. But at the end of the day, the sort of elements of leadership in a crisis situation are the same no matter what the crisis is. And I would just go back again to these sort of 5 principles. These are not exhaustive by any stretch, but be present and be seen. Communicate and share that information. Find a good messenger to deliver that message. Focus on the solution, not the problem. Jump the queue if necessary, and take action even if the decision is to do nothing. If you follow these 5 principles, and there are many others out there that you could use as well, you'll be well placed to be able to address a crisis, even something like a disease where you don't know where it's coming from and you don't know who the next victim is going to be. Thank you.
As our guests are moving back up to the stage, I would like to remind you that you can text your questions to the number on the screen or to the number on your program. And I'm going to start off asking a few questions, but then we'll turn to you for more questions. And Eric has to move furniture for us. Let's put him to work. All right, I'm going to start with Ambassador Malik. You've got the challenge of being a leader in an official government role at a time when politics are increasingly divisive and partisan, and people believe and see different things depending on what news source they look at. And quite honestly, most of them aren't learning much of anything about Africa. How do you get public officials and the American public to pay attention to the issues you have to deal with as an ambassador in Africa?
Well, fortunately, a lot of that is not really my responsibility. I'll be very honest, and I don't mean that to be flip. But my focus and my job is really to address some of those same issues, but within the context of Uganda, where I work. And so our primary responsibility is to help explain to the Ugandan government and to the people of Uganda what the U.S. thinks about the relationship that we have with the country, what our role is, what our image is. So that's hard enough in and of itself to sort of say, here's here's what policy shift has happened, here's where we think is important. But the good news is, I guess, in some ways, is that the programs and the programs and activities that we undertake in Uganda at the moment are not really very different than what they were 2 or 3 or 4 years ago. The challenge is the context in which all of that is happening, because the world is so interconnected. The Ugandans hear when there's a budget request to Congress that says, cut the development assistance budget in half. And Uganda's one of our largest recipients of U.S. Foreign assistance, and so people start to get nervous and they want to know what that means. That hasn't happened, but the media press around it, of course, gets people upset and worried. So the way I put it is, we focus on our job and on the work that we have to do in Uganda. Which is to advance our interests there, to help Uganda continue to develop, and try not to worry about all the craziness and the silliness that's going on in Washington and elsewhere, because we can't control it. We can control what we do on the ground in Uganda, and we can control what we do with our programs. That said, I think all of us who have worked for many, many years in Africa or on African issues continue to be very frustrated, and this is not a new development, about the fact that there's very little knowledge in the United States, in the general populace, about Africa, and the fact that it is not one country, which you hear all the time. There are 54 countries, and they are all very, very different. Although there are a lot of similarities and a lot of the same problems. So in my own little way, after 30 some odd years of doing this, I do what I can to advance that understanding, but it's going to take a whole lot more people than me to make that happen.
Thank you. Jason, I wanted to ask you a question. You mentioned the issues of implicit bias with teachers in the classroom and how they perceive some of their students. I hear those same kind of biases articulated among the public and even among some of our elected officials. Things like if these kids didn't have a bad attitude, or if they would just behave themselves, they'd get more out of their education, and that they wouldn't be facing the expulsions and things like that you mentioned. What do you say to people like, how do we get the public, and particularly the officials who could do more perhaps, to encourage teachers and to prepare teachers to deal with the challenges and to help the students? How do we help them get past their implicit biases?
That's a really great question. To a story. So we're working with a state rep now. One of our next phases of our program is to start working on local policy issues around education. And we actually had a state rep who's head of the State Education Appropriations Committee come visit one of our teachers' classrooms. He told me that was the first time he's visited a classroom in 30 years. And he's like controlling the budget for education in North Carolina. So like he doesn't know teaching, right? Like he doesn't know the kids. He hasn't stepped in front of the classroom. When I took him in front of our students and he had authentic conversations, you can see first his guard was like this, and you can see him slowly open up and talk about his own experiences and his kids' experiences and really relate to the students as well. So a lot of that is this exposure. We have to, like, I know, Brian Stevenson always talks about this idea of being proximate to the problem. And I don't think our elected officials or a lot of folks aren't proximate to education. It's like everyone has a theory about education because they went to school. But it's a little different when you're actually teaching or you're working with students more directly.
I like it. They have the theory and they went to school 40 years ago. Yeah. The school's the same. Beth, as you started going through those numbers, I was overwhelmed just listening to the challenges that the folks in Detroit were facing. I cannot imagine how overwhelming and demoralizing that must have been for the people working in it. How do you as a leader help build morale and help people to keep going, and just how do you decide which issues to address, and how do you keep your team from sort of caving into that overwhelming situation?
Well, there were a couple things that we were able to do. The upside of having an emergency manager is you don't actually have to follow any civil service or union rules, which gave, so we knew that as we were looking to reorganize, we had to pay people what they were worth. So we had people who had been there a long time who got cut after cut after cut after pay cut. And so we made the decision, and the mayor and the council were supportive, and the emergency manager signed off, of we did a consolidation so that all of technology was in technology, so that people weren't going, there were different technology groups doing completely different things. We were able to redo all the job descriptions because we really didn't need key punch operators anymore because we didn't have a mainframe, but we still had people in those job positions. So we were able to redo all of the job descriptions. And then the important thing, and my friend John Hill, who was the CFO, who I always hashtag as the best work spouse ever, was very supportive because he controlled the budget of making the jobs pay what was the going rate in the area. So we redid all the jobs, we redid all the compensation for that, but then everybody had to compete on the open market to fill those jobs. So about a third of the folks made it and didn't make it, and 2/3 kind of did make it. So that gave everybody a morale boost because they were making what they should have been making all along. And then the big thing was when we came out of bankruptcy, the big thing that we had to do was replace all the computers on everybody's desk. So it was a huge rollout. And we were very careful, and we had some of our frontline folks serve on the committee when we actually brought in the vendor to replace all the computers. And we said to the vendor, you need to understand that this is the first project coming out of bankruptcy. And if it does not work, we have set the tone for whether this plan to come out of bankruptcy and to stay solvent is going to work or not. So we have to make this work. And they came in as a true vendor partner. And my team, because they had been cutting for so very long, had never had resources because everything was taken away. So part of what we also did was really provide a lot of training and education for folks to learn the new technologies, because we were also switching technology because nobody uses Novell really anymore. So we moved to Microsoft Active Directory, and so we did all those things, and then the vendor made it fun. So as we rolled everything out to different departments, I said to my team, look, we're not going to be perfect, but the question is how do we recover quickly and earn the trust? So that's what we did. And I will tell you, even now, which has been almost 4 years, people still go back and said, hey, you all did that and you executed it really well. We didn't think IT was competent to do anything. And so it shifted everybody's attitude. My team members, were being paid what they should have been paid. We had the resources to make them successful, and we shifted the perception of that department within the organization, and then it just grew from there.
Okay, great. Eric, we're 10 years out from the greatest financial recession since the Great Depression, and a crisis that, by some accounts, could have been prevented with greater oversight and tighter regulations. And yet, as you've noted earlier today in a conversation, that when we have a crisis and we tighten regulations, it doesn't take too long before we start looking for ways to undo those regulations. So my question is, given that we have started trying to undo some of those very regulations that you guys had put in place at the time of the crisis, how worried are people in the know about the next financial crisis? Can we sleep well tonight, or do we need to go home in terror?
Well, I'm glad it's an easy question.
The last one, I had to make it count.
Yeah. I think it's fair to say that the institutions are better capitalized today than they were, that we have some additional restrictions on them than we had the last time. But I think what keeps everybody up at night a little bit is a worry that perhaps we're fighting the last war. These things tend to be different every time you see them. And it's not encouraging that a lot of the things we put in place after the crisis are starting to be rolled back, mostly on the fringes and not really the important stuff. And frankly, our legislative response was rushed, and it was messy, and it was big, and there's probably a lot of room for improvement in it if the political process can bear that. But I think overall, I think we feel like I think people will tell you that they think we're in a better position than we were going into 2008. But I think what you always worry about is what is it you're not thinking about. I mean, last time it was in housing. Now we're seeing highly leveraged loans in on the commercial side. And you worry about how out of control that might get. And the funny part of the first crisis was everybody thought by securitizing risk, they had actually reduced the risk that each individual entity held, and all they really did was spread the risk through the entire system. And so everybody got it exactly wrong last time in terms of where the risk was. And so that's the kind of thing you try to figure out the best you can and watch all the numbers and look for outliers. But that's, as far as sleeping tonight, I don't think we're on the edge of a 2008, but I think it's something that, as a former FDIC person, I would say always know your deposit insurance limits and make sure that you're fully protected by the federal government, because no one's ever lost a penny in an FDIC insured account.
Excellent. Thank you for that advice. All right. Now we'd like to hear from questions from our audience members. We have two Furman students who are a part of the Riley Institute Advanced team who are going to read those questions that have been submitted. And Amani, we're going to start with you.
Anyone on the panel, how do you maintain a broader, more hopeful outlook on your work, even while dealing with discouraging and complex problems? Was that clear? Do I need to repeat that? Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, it helps to be an optimist in the first place. I was talking about Ebola and this image of the boulder rolling down the hill. But I have many days like that in the work that I do, because things that, watching develop and measuring development on a daily basis, or are you improving the image of the United States? Are you advancing U.S. government interests in a country? You can't tell that from day to day. And you'll have really bad days where everything you try to do just doesn't work. Certainly was true in the Ebola crisis. We tried a lot of stuff. We didn't know what actually would work. When you have something on that scale that the world had never seen before. And so there were a lot of late nights and unhappy nights and days when all I wanted to really do was hide under my desk and just sort of tell everybody to go away and call somebody else. But the next day you get up and the challenges are still there and the problems are still there to be solved, and it's another day, and so you start over again. But I think you do have to be a bit of an optimist at heart. Otherwise you can, particularly in crisis situations, you can very easily spiral into a direction that isn't helpful to anyone. But you have to fundamentally believe that there is a solution and that you will find it, and you will eventually get there. I think the quote that they read was about perseverance. And so, puzzles are puzzles, and sometimes they're solved easily and quickly, and sometimes you got to figure out a different way to get to them and get to the solution. I don't know if anybody else has that.
I'd just say sense of mission. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think people who are in these situations are doing these jobs because they really believe in the mission, mm-hmm. and that's sort of your touchstone in a crisis. Mm-hmm. Is that's what you're there for, that's what you've trained for, and this is the ultimate challenge for you. And so it's really I think the ambassador's right. I think trying to be optimistic, but focusing on what you're there for and what you're trying to achieve, and just sort of block out everything else to get it done.
Hover a lot, and it's not always helpful. So I had a person who worked for me who said, because you're demanding, when we had a pretty critical incident, because you're demanding these hourly updates, we're spending 30 minutes of the hour trying to figure out how to respond to you. You're not being helpful. Will you please step away? Which was hard to hear, but it was nice that he could say that to me. So sometimes it's giving your team enough time to breathe, because I think, to the ambassador's point, I believe there always is a solution. It's sometimes you just have to have enough time to look at it and then be able to spin it in a lot of different directions to see what's going to work. And so then my job was to be the communications and the face both to our customers and to also manage upward to the mayor and the council. And so I took that pressure off them, but I knew that they could find the solution. But also knowing when to be the cheerleader or just bring in the pizza or whatever we're doing is helpful.
I think the thing that kind of stood out to me is celebrating small wins. So I think these are very complex issues. Like, there's no one solution to a lot of the issues that we're facing, but any small win is kind of like a win for progress, so to speak. So I think that's something that I had to learn as a teacher, and definitely in the work from a more of a systems level.
Johnny.
I have the other question. This is for anyone. And how do you include those most affected by the crisis in the decision-making process? And as a subset of that question, how do you avoid being seen as an outsider trying to fix the other person's problem?
Well, in Detroit, there has been a history of people from the outside coming in and telling Detroiters what to do, and they're frankly just tired of it, and they resent it. And so I think part of what those of us who were new to Detroit had to learn was history and what language meant. So when you say, and so 80% of Detroit are people of color. And so there has been a long history, even though it is a majority-minority city, there has been a history of white mayors doing urban development, which means you destroy functional black communities because you're going to put in a new freeway or you're going to do some kind of development, and then you push people out. So there's been a huge amount of history, not just in Detroit, but other places where that's happened. And so one of the things that the mayor does, and the mayor encourages all of his senior executives to do, is sit with community groups and listen. Because your response is you're listening, you try to listen to, your natural tendency is to listen, to respond, and defend what you're doing. But to listen and to walk with somebody in that journey and understand whether it's development or technology or whatever you're working on, is that it has to be that the people who are in that community should help drive the process. And so it's not one thing fits all from a development perspective. So in Southwest, our community is very leery of the situation that happened in Flint. They live next to a large oil refinery, and they don't trust, with good reason, the results from our state's environmental quality group, because they kept telling everybody in Flint that the water was safe to drink. So what's important to me as a person there is to be able to monitor air quality, because this refinery is there. So I think really being present and doing things that value folks' times. One of the things we heard back from folks is, do you all in the government ever talk to each other? Because we have answered this question 10 times. Talk to somebody, figure out what we said, and then come back and with that knowledge. So I think it's really being respectful, providing things like transportation and daycare to folks so that they can be fully participating, because if not, you get the same smaller group of people. So really finding intentional ways to be inclusive, whether it's, we have a lot of language barrier issues, so Spanish, Arabic, and Bengali. So really being very intentional to say, what is it that we can do that will bring as many people as possible into the conversation, and how do we listen to hear but not to respond?
Anybody else want to tackle that? Okay. Imani, do you have another question?
This is a question for Jason from Emma. Schools like Furman don't tend to recruit in low-income public schools. The price tag of college is limiting to lower-income students. What can schools like Furman do to intervene?
That's a good question. I think the biggest area is the idea of exposure. So I don't know what Furman's recruitment strategy is like. But I will say, like, none of my kids heard of Furman. But when I told them about Furman, all of them wanted to go. So like, how do we get more students just access to step on campus and see the community, but also like coming into those spaces as well. So I think it should be a two-way street. But my biggest suggestion would be exposure.
Johnny.
And this is for Ambassador Malik and Mr. Spittler. And you both emphasize the importance of communication and confidence. And how does social media and the rise of fake news decreasing trust in the media, a main source of that communication, make this difficult? And as a subset of that question, how can accurate information be shared quickly when the facts on the ground, that very information is changing so quickly?
Fake news. It's a challenge everywhere. So I will say, just in the as an aside, I think it's in the Ugandan context, political environment currently, where you have a government who's been in power for a very long time and is doubling down on staying there. They also we hear the terminology about fake news very regularly, and in fact, there is a lot of fake news there because people make things up. But I think it's we use social media, and we have to continue to find new ways to use it, because it really is, it is a tool that's very useful for us in terms of messaging, whether it's we want to talk about something that we've done, whether we want to make a statement about something the government of Uganda or Liberia did, or whether we want to get just information out into the hands of people, information about how you keep yourself safe from Ebola, or no, there's not really a problem. If you travel to this part of the country, you're going to be fine. And in the old days, we did that by, foot telegram. People walked from door to door. We had wardens who were spreading messages to people who happened to be around, or we sent out, messages, or we used radios, or we used telephones, and we literally did telephone trees and called people. Those are not very effective ways, but that's all we had. So I think we have to embrace social media, but we have to recognize, and certainly after everything we have been through in the United States after the 2016 election, with all of the evidence and information that's come out about the ways that people were being manipulated through things like Facebook and social media posts, we have to realize that there are ways that everything we see on those platforms are not necessarily accurate. But that doesn't mean we should throw them out with the bathwater and not do anything with them, because we need, in countries like Uganda or in countries like Liberia, where there's very little internet penetration, although mobile technology is quite large, a lot of people still, and I think you even said this in Detroit, Beth, that don't have data packages, so they're not actually accessing even some of these social media platforms. Some of it's texting, and WhatsApp is a really big communication tool because it's encrypted and the government can't read it. But it's also a way we can use. It's another tool that we can use to put out information and make sure it gets to people. So, no media platform is without its risks in terms of what goes on it, because, we used to have the saying in the days when we were key punching cards to read in the mainframe computer. In the basement of Plyler Hall was, garbage in, garbage out. So if you have that one little error in your program, it's not going to give you the result that you want when it comes out on the other end. So it's an increasing challenge, and I think all of us globally are going to have to figure out how we better manage social media platforms, because there is truly a risk, and a lot of governments, particularly authoritarian ones, who don't want to be bothered, are just as happy to shut them all down because they are worried, and they have seen where messages spread very, very quickly. So on the one hand, what information you want to disseminate about an event, while it's changing rapidly because the event itself is evolving, there's also other stuff going around that happens very, very quickly at the speed of light, if you will, and everybody is in a reactive mode. So I don't know what we do about it, but I think with every new technological advance, societies encounter difficulties. Initially they look, oh, this is great, we all love it, everyone embraces it, and then you start to realize that it's it's maybe a blessing in some ways, but it's also a curse.
I think in our crisis, we didn't have a huge problem with fake news. Our real news was bad enough.
Yeah.
That's what we were dealing with. But I do think going forward, it is an issue that it's something we have to worry about. I mean, one of the things when you deal with something that's based entirely on confidence, we had during the crisis, it didn't get much attention, we had a bank failure run that was triggered by a tweet. And so you can see the potential for very destructive activity in that area. And I don't think we have a real good sense of that right now, or how to deal with it. So in the financial world, I'd put it more in the category of a possible future crisis. And when I was talking about not knowing what that next thing is, you can very easily see concerns, cyber attacks, those kinds of things. You have to worry. They happen very quickly, and I think Beth would agree. Nowadays, you don't even have to worry about them stealing your data. All they have to do is encrypt it so you can't get to it. And that's a huge issue. And imagine being a financial institution where all of a sudden you come in on Monday morning and you can't tell you have no idea how much money your customers have in the bank and how much to give them. So.
All right, our time has expired. I want to thank our guests for coming. Thank the Riley Institute for getting us all to where we needed to be tonight. And thank you all for coming. I would like to invite you. We have a reception out in the lobby. Our guests will be joining you there in a few moments if you have follow-up questions with them. If you don't mind, give us about 5 minutes on stage to get some photos with them. And my colleagues in the Political Science Department, come join us, please, for that. Thank you all, and have a good evening.